The odds of this sequence occurring 9 times in the randomness of our genetic code is 1 in 10 trillion.
In 2025, a scientific paper published in the journal Science dropped something unexpected into the world of ancient genetics. A 700-year-old female skeleton buried alone in the mountains of Yunnan province in southwestern China carried DNA that nobody had seen before.
They looked into the human genome and they found what appeared to be an extraterrestrial stamp on our genetic code. And it operated very much like a mathematical type of code.
Not similar to any known ancient population, not matching modern East Asians in the way researchers expected. Her genes told a story that reached back 40,000 years into the past, to a time when most of the world was locked in ice and humans were scattered in small, isolated pockets across continents. This wasn't just another ancient burial. It was evidence of a lineage so deeply diverged from other populations that scientists had to ask, where had these people been hiding all this time? The Xingyi woman, a skeleton that shouldn't exist. The woman was found at the Xingyi archaeological site in central Yunnan, a region nestled between the towering Tibetan plateau to the northwest and the dense forests of Southeast Asia to the south. She was buried 7,100 years ago without grave goods, no pottery, no tools, nothing to suggest elaborate ritual or social hierarchy, just a simple burial in the earth. Archaeologists initially thought she might represent one of the early farming communities that were spreading across southern China during that period. But when her DNA was sequenced as part of a massive study led by Professor Fu Xiaomei from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the results didn't fit any existing model. Her genome didn't cluster with other ancient East Asians from the same time period. It didn't match the genetic profiles of people who lived in northern China, or those from Southeast Asia, or even the handful of other ancient individuals recovered from Yunnan itself. Instead, her ancestry stood apart, a branch that had split off from the main East Asian family tree tens of thousands of years earlier. Researchers named her lineage after the site where she was found, Xingyi ancestry. And the more they looked at her DNA, the more they realized they were staring at something that had been invisible until now. A ghost. What exactly is a ghost population?
We call it a ghost population because this is not a population which we have identified based on any fossil evidence.
In genetics, a ghost population doesn't mean something supernatural or mysterious in the paranormal sense. It's a technical term for an ancient group of people whose DNA we can detect in modern populations, but whose physical remains had never been found until recently, if at all. Imagine trying to reconstruct a family tree, but one of the branches is missing. You know it has to be there because the math doesn't work otherwise. You see traces of its influence in the genes of descendants, but you can't find the actual bones or artifacts of the people who carried those genes. That's a ghost lineage. They existed, they lived, they had children, and those children mixed with other groups over thousands of years. But for some reason, either they died out without leaving many fossils behind, or their remains simply haven't been discovered yet. In the case of the Xingyi woman, scientists had been building genetic models of how modern Tibetans and other East Asian populations came to be. And no matter how they tweaked the models, there was always a chunk of DNA in Tibetans that couldn't be explained by known sources. About 20% of their ancestry didn't match anything previously documented. It was there in the numbers, in the genetic signatures, but it had no face. Until now. The 2025 Yannan study, 127 ancient genomes unlocked. Professor Fu Xiaomei and her team at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology didn't just sequence one skeleton. They analyzed the genomes of 127 ancient individuals from sites across Yunnan province, spanning a timeline from 7,100 years ago all the way up to about 1,400 years ago. This is one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever conducted in East Asia, and Yunnan is arguably the best place to do it. The province sits at a geographic crossroads. To the north and east, you have the great river valleys of the Yellow River and Yangtze, where farming cultures developed and spread. To the west, the land rises sharply into the Tibetan plateau, one of the most extreme environments on Earth. To the south, the terrain drops into Southeast Asia, a region of immense cultural and linguistic diversity. People have been moving through Yunnan for tens of thousands of years, following rivers, crossing mountain passes, adapting to forests and highlands. The researchers used cutting-edge sequencing techniques to extract and analyze DNA from bones and teeth, some of which were thousands of years old and heavily degraded. They compared these ancient genomes to each other, to other ancient samples from across Asia, and to the DNA of modern populations. What they found was a patchwork of ancestry, waves of migration and mixing that reshaped the genetic landscape over millennia. But the most striking discovery was the Xingyi woman and the lineage she represented. A lineage that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, a 40,000-year divergence. How old is this lineage, really? When geneticists say a population diverged 40,000 years ago, they mean that the ancestors of that group and the ancestors of other groups stopped interbreeding and began evolving separately around that time. It's not an exact date, more of an estimate based on the number of genetic differences that have accumulated. The Xingyi ancestry split from other East Asian populations roughly 40,000 years ago, which places it in the same deep time frame as the Tianyuan individual, a famous 40,000-year-old skeleton found near Beijing. Tianyuan is one of the oldest modern human remains in East Asia, and his genome is used as a reference point for understanding early human diversity in the region. The fact that the Xingyi lineage is just as ancient and just as diverged means it represents a separate branch that somehow survived in isolation for an incredibly long time. During the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the Ice Age that peaked around 20,000 years ago, much of northern Asia became nearly uninhabitable. Human populations contracted into refugia, small pockets of land where the climate was stable enough to support life. Yunnan, with its complex topography and relatively mild conditions, was one of those refugia. The mountains provided shelter. The rivers and valleys offered resources, and small groups of people, including the ancestors of the Xingyi woman, held on. They didn't vanish. They didn't get absorbed immediately by incoming waves of people from the north. They persisted, genetically distinct, for tens of thousands of years. And then, around 9,500 to 4,000 years ago, they began to mix with new populations migrating into the region. That's when the ghost lineage started to spread beyond its mountain refuge. The missing 20%, solving the Tibetan DNA puzzle. Modern Tibetans have always been something of a genetic puzzle. They live at altitudes where oxygen is scarce, and their bodies have adapted in remarkable ways. But when researchers tried to model their ancestry using ancient DNA from northern East Asians, the picture was incomplete. About 80% of Tibetan DNA could be traced to populations that migrated onto the plateau from the northeast, likely starting around 9,500 years ago. But the remaining 20% was unaccounted for. It didn't match any known ancient group. It looked old, deeply diverged, but there was no source population in the archaeological record that fit. The 2025 Yunnan study provided the answer. The Xingyi lineage, that 40,000-year-old branch that survived in Yunnan, contributed directly to the ancestry of Tibetans. At some point, people carrying this ancient DNA moved north and west, out of the relative comfort of Yunnan's valleys and up into the harsh environment of the Tibetan plateau. They mixed with incoming northern populations, and their genes became part of the Tibetan gene pool. This isn't just a minor footnote, it's a major piece of the puzzle, explaining a chunk of ancestry that geneticists had been scratching their heads over for years. The ghost lineage wasn't hiding in some remote, unreachable place. It was right there in Yunnan, waiting to be found. Denisovans, high altitudes, and ancient interbreeding. There's another layer to this story, and it involves a different kind of ancient human altogether. In 2019, scientists confirmed that a 160,000-year-old jawbone found in the Baishia Karst cave on the Tibetan plateau belonged to a Denisovan, an extinct hominin group closely related to Neanderthals. The jawbone was too old and degraded to yield DNA, but proteins extracted from the fossil matched the Denisovan profile. This was huge because it showed that Denisovans had adapted to high altitudes long before modern humans arrived. And here's where it gets interesting. Modern Tibetans carry a gene variant called EPS1, which helps their bodies cope with low oxygen levels at high altitude. This gene didn't come from their East Asian ancestors. It came from Denisovans through interbreeding that happened roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. About 5% of the Tibetan genome is Denisovan in origin, a genetic gift that turned out to be incredibly useful for survival on the plateau. So now we have 3 layers of ancestry in Tibetans: the northern East Asian component, which makes up the bulk of their DNA.
And if you look in these black shaded circles in these pie charts, this is where the Denisovan ancestry is present today, highest frequency in the Philippines and in Australia.
The Denisovan component, a small but critical contribution for altitude adaptation. And the Xingyi ghost lineage, that deeply diverged East Asian branch that adds another 20% to the mix. The Xingyi people weren't Denisovans. They were fully modern humans, Homo sapiens. But they lived in a region where Denisovans had also once thrived, and it's possible that some of the early mixing between modern humans and Denisovans happened in or near Yunnan, before the descendants of those mixed populations moved onto the plateau. The genetic history of Tibet isn't simple. It's a layered, complex story of migration, adaptation, and interbreeding that stretches back deep into the Pleistocene, the Austroasiatic connection, beyond Tibet. The 2025 study didn't just focus on the Tibetan connection. It also revealed another distinct ancestry emerging in Yunnan around 5,500 years ago, which researchers called the Central Yunnan ancestry. This lineage is tied to early Austroasiatic-speaking peoples, a language family that today includes Vietnamese, Khmer, and many other languages spoken across Southeast Asia. The appearance of this ancestry coincides with major cultural and demographic shifts in the region, possibly linked to the spread of rice farming and new technologies. People carrying this Central Yunnan ancestry eventually moved south and east, contributing to the genetic makeup of populations across modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond. It's a reminder that Yunnan wasn't just a backwater. It was a dynamic, pivotal region where different human lineages met, mixed, and gave rise to the incredible diversity we see in East and Southeast Asia today. The ghost lineage wasn't alone. It was part of a broader tapestry of human movement and interaction that shaped the entire region. Ice Age Refugia: why Yunnan preserved this ancient DNA. Geography matters. Yunnan is a mountainous province with deep river valleys, dense forests, and a climate that stayed relatively stable even during the worst of the Ice Age. While much of northern Asia was locked in permafrost and glaciers, Yunnan remained habitable. These kinds of places, called refugia, acted as shelters for plants, animals, and humans during periods of extreme climate stress. Small populations could survive in these pockets, isolated from each other and from the larger waves of migration happening elsewhere. Over time, genetic drift and isolation would cause these groups to diverge, accumulating unique mutations and losing contact with other branches of the human family tree. When the ice began to retreat and conditions improved, people from these refugia could expand again, sometimes mixing with newcomers, sometimes being absorbed or replaced. The Xingyi lineage survived because Yunnan provided the right conditions: stable food sources, defensible terrain, and enough isolation to maintain genetic distinctiveness. But not so much isolation that they couldn't eventually re-enter the broader human story when the time was right. Why ghost doesn't mean alien, and why people think it does. Let's be clear. There is zero evidence that the Xingyi lineage or any other ghost population has anything to do with extraterrestrial life or ancient astronauts. The term ghost is a scientific metaphor, not a claim about the supernatural, but the language used in genetics can be confusing to the public. When you hear that a lineage diverged 40,000 years ago and was deeply diverged from other humans, it sounds exotic. Add in the fact that this ancestry was invisible until now, and you've got the perfect recipe for speculation. Social media and sensational headlines do the rest, framing the discovery as something mysterious or otherworldly. In reality, deeply diverged just means that the Xingyi ancestors and other East Asians stopped mixing a long time ago, so their DNA accumulated differences. They were still Homo sapiens, fully modern humans, just genetically distinct because of isolation. There's nothing alien about it. It's the same process that creates diversity in any species. You separate populations for long enough, and they start to look different genetically. The ghost label has scientific value, but it also fuels myths. It's worth remembering that the real story, the story of human survival and adaptation over tens of thousands of years, is far more fascinating than any fictional alternative. The discovery of the Xingyi lineage is more than just a footnote in the history of human genetics. It rewrites part of the story of how East Asians came to be, filling in gaps that researchers didn't even know how to fill until they found her bones. It shows that human diversity runs deeper and older than we often assume, that there are still hidden chapters waiting to be uncovered in the DNA of ancient skeletons buried in remote mountain valleys. And it reminds us that the past is not a simple, linear march of progress. It's a tangled web of migrations, isolations, extinctions, and survivals, each thread contributing to the rich tapestry of who we are today.